In Tokyo, what is happening around Greenland is perceived as a strategic shock whose scale goes far beyond the European continent and directly affects the foundations of the entire post-war security system on which the Western world has rested. According to sources close to Japanese diplomatic, military, and analytical circles, Donald Trump's actions have become a signal for Japan that a new and far more dangerous era is beginning, one in which the United States is starting to dismantle the security architecture it itself built over decades. Closed reports circulating within Japanese government structures and defense agencies emphasize that the threat of force against the territory of an ally and the very possibility of a military invasion of Greenland undermine not just individual agreements, but the very idea of alliances based on trust and rules. For Tokyo, this is particularly painful, since Japan has historically built its security, economic development, and foreign policy on the assumption of the predictability and rationality of American leadership. This is precisely why the current crisis is seen in Japan not as another diplomatic dispute, but as a moment of truth in which previous axioms cease to function. Under the leadership of Sanai Takaichi, the Japanese leadership has taken a clear and principled position of full solidarity with Denmark, emphasizing that the defense of Greenland is not about protecting a specific territory, but about defending the basic principles of the international order. Japanese analytical assessments state directly that if a forceful revision of borders becomes acceptable within the Western Bloc, it will open a Pandora's box worldwide, legitimizing similar actions in other regions, primarily in Asia. Publicly, Tokyo acts with extreme caution, avoiding sharp language and direct accusations against Washington, since it understands how fragile the balance in relations with its key ally remains. However, behind closed doors, according to insiders, the tone of discussions is far harsher and darker. Increasingly, the idea is voiced that what is at stake is the fate of the Western world as a coherent project, not merely another crisis of trust between allies. In Japanese government circles, it is emphasized that if the annexation of Greenland is allowed today, tomorrow the same logic could be applied to Taiwan, the Senkaku Islands, or any other disputed territories, and then all previous Western arguments about the inadmissibility of force will lose their meaning. This is why, sources claim, Japan is considering the possibility of supporting Europe at all levels, from active diplomatic coordination and economic interaction to symbolic but highly significant military steps. This does not involve direct military confrontation with the US or participation in combat operations against American forces, but scenarios are being discussed in Tokyo under which Japan could send a limited contingent, instructors, or auxiliary units to demonstrate solidarity with European allies. Such a step, according to Japanese strategists, would be a historic signal that Japan is ready to defend Western values, even in a situation where the source of the threat comes from within the Western camp itself. Domestically, these discussions are accompanied by deep reassessments of the entire foreign policy doctrine. According to insiders, Japanese elites are increasingly asking how acceptable it is in the future to rely exclusively on American security guarantees, and whether the time has come to accelerate the formation of a more independent defense and partnership strategy. The darkest and at the same time most serious scenario currently discussed in Japanese analytical centers remains the option in which Donald Trump nevertheless decides on a use of force. In that case, experts believe, this would mean not merely a crisis of NATO or a temporary split among alliances, but the effective end of the Western world in its familiar form. For Japan, this would become a point of no return, after which the previous close and almost unconditional ties with the US would no longer be possible in the same format. According to sources, Tokyo is already preparing for a worst-case scenario in which Japan will have to build its own security system based not on a single dominant partner, but on a network of alliances, regional cooperation, and its own military capabilities. In this context, the crisis around Greenland is viewed in Japan as a general rehearsal for a future world in which rules are no longer guaranteed and force increasingly replaces law. This, according to Japanese analysts, is what makes what is happening truly dangerous. It is not about the fate of a single island, but about a choice between preserving a rules-based international order and sliding into a new era of global instability in which even the closest allies are forced to prepare for one another as potential sources of threat. Against this backdrop, a growing view within the Japanese establishment is that the crisis around Greenland is not the cause, but merely a trigger for deep processes that had been building inside the Western world for a long time. According to sources familiar with closed-door discussions in Tokyo, Japan is increasingly realizing that the former model of international relations, in which the US acted as the unquestioned center of decision-making and guarantor of stability, is rapidly losing its predictability. This is forcing Japanese strategists to rethink not only foreign policy, but also Japan's own role in the world. Analytical notes emphasize that if the Western order is indeed entering a phase of fragmentation, Japan cannot afford to remain a passive observer and must participate in shaping a new security configuration, even if this requires painful decisions. This is why debates in Tokyo are intensifying over the need to expand Japan's international presence, including beyond the traditional Asian theater. Supporting Europe in the Greenland situation is seen as the first test of Japan's readiness to act as a global player rather than solely a regional power. At the same time, it is stressed that this is not about breaking with the US for the sake of confrontation, but about an attempt to preserve the very idea of the Western world, even if its former leader is stepping away from responsibility for its own principles. Japanese reports increasingly use the wording that the real threat today comes not so much from the West's traditional rivals as from the internal erosion of trust among allies. If this process is not stopped, it will inevitably lead to the fragmentation of the global system, in which each country will be forced to rely exclusively on itself. For Japan, this means the need to accelerate the strengthening of defense capabilities, develop strategic autonomy, and expand its network of partnerships, including closer interaction with European states. Analysts emphasize that even a symbolic Japanese military presence in Europe would be a powerful signal that Tokyo is ready to take responsibility for preserving the international order. At the same time, there is an understanding that such steps will inevitably complicate relations with Washington, especially if the Trump administration continues along a path of unilateral decisions. This is why Japanese circles increasingly speak of the need to prepare for a world in which the alliance with the US ceases to be without alternatives. In this sense, the crisis around Greenland is becoming a moment of strategic maturation for Japan, when the country is forced to choose between habitual dependence and responsible leadership. And the longer the current escalation continues, the clearer it becomes that the decisions made today will determine not only the fate of a single island, but also Japan's place in the emerging world order for decades to come.